What up chaps, I'm MagicalMike and recently I've been playing Total War Warhammer 1. To be honest, I've been pretty much obsessed with it, like no other game I've played in many years at this point. I genuinely hear unit voice acting in my sleep, it has gotten so embedded. So of course I want to talk about it, and if you're interested then give the video a like and drop a sub if you're feeling particularly cool. Cheers. I have a friend that absolutely loves Total War games, and he's tried to get me interested a number of times, and it just hasn't really managed to land. I've watched him play hours of Shogun, he's tried to get me into Attila in a multiplayer campaign, and nothing was really clicking with me. I think mostly I wanted to get into giant army battles, and we never really bothered to do them, but also I wasn't all that interested in the historical time periods in those games. Rome, meh. Feudal Japan, meh. The closest I got to really getting into it was Medieval 2, which is pretty old and not the easiest to run these days. Not that I mind running old games, I mean look at all the stuff I do videos on the channel, but yeah, the idea of knights and swords and archers and castles and all that stuff was along the right lines, but no, it turns out that Warhammer was the secret key to getting me interested. I'm not even a huge Warhammer fan. I've only really played Vermintide 2, but the character dialogue in that game is fantastic, so I found myself wanting to immerse myself in the greater lore overall, and also seeing just how much stuff there is in Total War games, and Mandalore's reviews on the second one were enough to get me to give it a proper try. Fantasy units, fantasy structures, fantasy lore, and a solid core of Total War mechanics that have been there throughout the series, and suddenly I found myself playing so much of the game. Wizards, magic, fantastical creatures, and huge faction variety are also massive pluses for me. So since this is my first game, I checked through all the faction choices at first and settled on the Dwarfs, because they have a label calling their playstyle as easy in the selection screen. I didn't really know what about them makes them so easy, but I figured, why not, let's go doorway. I'm also not really a fan of fantasy dwarves for the most part either, but they actually turned out quite fun in Warhammer. Kazukan Kazukit Ha. One of their main mechanics is the Book of Grudges. See, they're pretty good at holding these forever, and wronging a dwarf can bring huge repercussions and revenge from the wee Yorkshire-voiced lads. In terms of game mechanics, it's a series of objectives that you have to meet that usually involve taking revenge on enemies that defeat you or cause you problems. And if you don't do them quickly enough, then you start to take public order penalties and that kind of stuff. I never had any real issues apart from the times that they kept asking me to assassinate characters, which is a mechanic that I didn't really get into much and found the chances to be way too low most of the time. Ultimately, the grudges were more of a short-term objective compass to try and point you in the right direction. And each faction has a specific mechanic like this. I know Britannia has an honour system and the peasant economy, which I haven't experienced yet, and the orcs have a fightiness thing that I'm not yet familiar with, but the fact that every faction is slightly different makes them more interesting to learn and play in their campaigns, over, say, just different coloured knights and archers from different countries in a historical Total War. These mechanics also translate to playing against them, too. Learning their units and their army strengths and weaknesses becomes a detailed part of the war game. I've only played as the Dwarfs at the time of writing this, and a solid 3/4 of my overall campaign were fighting against the Greenskins and the occasional Beastmen uprising. The rest was against Chaos, a little against the Norskins, and a few run-ins with the Vampire Counts, who, by the way, have the coolest looking siege maps. So, I became intimately familiar with Dwarf, Orc, and Goblin units, and this stuff is why I wanted to get into the Total War series in the first place, the army battles. Being able to zoom right into the action and watch all the little details of hundreds of units all animated properly in their individual engagements is like nothing else I've seen in gaming. There's no other game that comes to mind that comes close to this experience, and I'm all about watching a cavalry charge smash through the lines or an organ gun obliterate a bunch of trolls. It's great. Siege is a wonderful thing, but you can definitely have too much of it. Siege can't really turn around very easily, so cavalry can break through to it, and that was a lot of my experience as the Dwarfs. They're slow, they're heavily armoured, and they rely on heavy units and superior siege engines, which makes a lot of the units really tough and harder to make mistakes with, but not without their weaknesses too. I absolutely loved a ton of their units though. In particular, the Ironbreakers are insanely good at holding a long, thin line against huge amounts of enemy infantry. They're amazing to watch as they throw satchels of blasting charges at the oncoming infantry charges, and then pick the shields back up to absorb the charge like they didn't even feel it. Basically, watching any group of units fighting it out or even just idling around is very cool. Beautifully animated, and so many individuals doing their own thing really does add to the believability of these units actually engaging each other in combat. My favourites aside from the Ironbreakers and Organ Guns are Thunderers, just for their selection sound being them shouting it with such vigour, Flame Drakes for being pyromaniacs and melting through all sorts of horrifying monsters with such ease, and Rune Lords for being such helpful yet basic casters to learn those ability mechanics from. I know that I can't wait to play the other factions too because their units all look fascinating. In particular, the vampire counts seem uniquely designed, and I really want to play with all the monsters and ghouls. Big units, big fun. Is what I'm saying, apparently. Now, that's okay. Overall, I had a relatively diverse army in the end. I had a wall of Ironbreakers to take the brunt of the enemy charge, a couple of siege engines to encourage them to come to me, a couple of Organ Guns to protect the flanks and set up a kill box, one group of Slayers to punish cavalry charges in the rear, a group of Thunderers to shoot the heck out of monsters, a couple of Longwords to keep leadership high and make sure everyone stands firm, some Miners with blasting charges to break siege doors open and cause some fiery chaos, one supporting Rune Lord, and finally a Gyrocopter to harass enemy siege, or keep specific units from rallying once their leadership broke. This army felt pretty stationary, but was very capable of dealing with a lot of punishment, just as long as I could protect my guns, which admittedly was not always possible. I definitely learned the hard way that cavalry is a doorway weakness, with savage black orc big boys on boars causing a ton of problems for my formations early on. But I think the faction is classed as easy because they don't need to move around all that much as long as you start with a decent formation. Which I suppose brings us on to the overall control and RTS, or real-time strategy gameplay. You can definitely get overwhelmed by everything happening all at once, but this is no StarCraft level of micromanagement. You can even pause the game or slow it right down to give you orders in single player, making things much more easily manageable. I find myself getting used to things at a pretty slow pace, trying to keep track of up to 20 units at a time, so it could be a learning curve for you, but practice should make perfect, I guess. I eventually got better at it, but I've yet to play with a more mobile army, and could often leave my front line to just kinda do as it wished, so we'll see how deep the rabbit hole goes with a less tanky and more movement-reliant army, I suppose. One problem I did have was in the snow maps, where the yellow cones of fire were about impossible to see against the bright snow. This made it extremely hard to know if enemies were in range of all my guns, so it'd be nice if there were options to change that UI colour somehow, but there isn't, which is a bit of an oversight, unless there's a mod that I'm not aware of, but I've not yet been able to find such a thing. While I'm on it, a couple of other bad things are the price of DLC, including selling blood and gore effects, which is very disappointing, and a serious lack of diplomatic options in the game. I get that the game is total war and not total peace, but it would be nice if I could trade settlements or ask allies to stop warring with other factions that I'm also allied with. One set of dwarfs in particular would not let a grudge with the elves go. 200 turns, by the way. 200 turns of war. Thanks, Ironhammer, you absolute git. And I had no interest in attacking Athel Lauren, but was dragged into that anyway with no way to ask them to stop. I also owned an important hold in the northeast for the entire campaign, with no way to buy the other one in the region off my allies, making my settlement there rather inefficient. I guess this isn't really a big problem, but I really did want to try and play with the other dwarf factions as allies, rather than confederating them as my own. It worked out for a long time, but ultimately war never changes, and the book was slammed shut with yet another true fury, as is the dwarf way. So, yeah, overall I loved the battles and continue to do so. I had a really tough time against Chaos, which as it turns out is a super interesting story beat that leads all factions to band together for quite a while. It makes for a fun turn of events where all your old enemies potentially become friends to hold out against the tide of a literal demon spawn that descend from the north. Though this part of the game became quite different to most of the lead up to that point, where I was pretty much dedicated to hunting these huge armies down and defending against overwhelming odds. I much preferred the world-conquering gameplay and taking over settlements to the idea of focusing wholly on one set of angry chosen lords. The sequel game actually has an option to turn off this invasion, which suggests to me that it isn't a very popular mechanic. Maybe there's a mod to do so also in 1, since there's a lot of Steam Workshop support for the game, but again I haven't really looked that far into stuff like that. And I suppose the last major thing to talk briefly about is the campaign map and settlement management, since these are quite large components of the overall game. I didn't expect to actually enjoy the campaign map grand strategy gameplay or the settlement management at all, but in the end I was surprisingly into it. At first it's definitely a lot of info to digest. I had no idea what I was doing and pretty much just followed what the rudimentary tutorial was telling me to build. But over time I learned the importance of growth, allowing settlements to be upgraded, public order to stop rebel armies from spawning and becoming an issue, trade resources and income generating buildings to keep your coffers flowing and to fund your army stuff, and then, speaking of which, finally army unit buildings that allow for recruitment of specific new units. I'd say that the default view for buildings isn't that great, but the building browser tree makes things a lot easier to understand for me. But I found myself absorbed in that management every single turn regardless of whether or not I needed to be looking at it, and was quite satisfied with the end results of my empire, which flourished. More so than the actual empire, in fact, that kind of got flattened by chaos in the end, and never truly recovered for another 50 turns. Basically, the game was a bit of a learning curve throughout, but once I had a grasp of each mechanic, things got a lot smoother and I became shockingly invested in the game as things built and built and built. I would recommend it if you've looked at the battle gameplay alone and thought that looked fun, because that's where I started and now I absolutely love it. There's tons more I could talk about and plenty of details that I'm skimming over, like ambushes and siege battles. Most of how diplomacy works, I didn't even talk about victory conditions, which are based on your faction and chosen lord, and the list goes on and on and on because the Total War games are enormous, which is why Mando's review of 2 is over an hour long and even he skips a lot of stuff. But it goes to show that the complexity and value you can get out of these is really good if you find yourself interested by the particular subject matter. It turns out Warhammer just happened to be the key to unlocking my interest in the Total War series. And now I think I'll go and start a Bretonnian campaign, because a Doomstack of Grail Knights sounds like excellent fun. Until I have to do a siege battle, of course. I wonder how good horses are at climbing castle walls. Towers and rams, ladders and ladders and towers and rams. Oh no. Well, cheers for watching.